Hello everyone, my name is Yannick Pelletier, I'm a Swiss Grandmaster, and in this video we are going to take a look at the game from the Candidates Tournament in Berlin 2018 between Levon Aronian and Fabiano Caruana. A very important game, as Caruana, one of the leaders at this point when the game was played, managed to win that game against Aronian, the Armenian player not in shape at all in this tournament. And in that game, unfortunately for him, he was perhaps caught in the opening by Fabiano Caruana. We are going to take a look, a special look at this opening, which is quite dear to me because I've played it with black many times and I have contributed a little bit to the development of it. So Aronian going for d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5. Difficult to know what to expect from Caruana against d4. He can play the Grunfeld, he can play, of course, classical openings. And here, after knight c3, d takes c4, as you can see, he goes for the Vienna variation of the Queen's Gambit, which is a hybrid opening between the Queen's Gambit, of course, Queen's Gambit accepted, since you can see d takes c4 has been played, but it also has a flair of kind of semi-Slav, Nimzo, basically keeping a character of its own. Well, actually the variation chosen by Caruana is not the typical line. After e4, bishop b4, bishop g5, here instead of the normal move c5, which is the starting point of the main line and sometimes very complicated variations rising from there. Well, instead of this, he went for h6. Well, actually, if you're interested in this opening, I have prepared a DVD which is going to be published in 2018 by ChessBase after the summer. So if you're interested in knowing what's happening in this opening and trying to learn ideas there, you can obviously try and get this DVD. H6 is a very special move actually, because it became popular only around 2009-10 thanks to the efforts of Vladimir Kramnik, who brought it back into fashion. At first sight, it doesn't really appear to be a good move, because after bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, bishop takes c4, white has been able to recover the pawn by keeping a strong pawn center. But Kramnik has seen further. First of all, after the move c5, which is played here by Caruana, black challenges the opponent's pawn center. Moreover, in the long term, black has two bishops, which can be a really important trump. Castle, c takes d4, e5, queen d8. We are really following the main line of this variation. That's the real challenge against black's idea. Knight e4 here. It's quite important that white doesn't try and get back the pawn immediately. After knight takes d4, it would be quite difficult for white to develop an initiative, and white actually might even be forced after bishop c5 to kind of move the knight and exchange queens. The exchange of queens would be favorable to black, because his bishop pair would then come stronger into play. And also the pawn structure in an endgame with this advanced pawn on e5 could be a bit vulnerable for white. So the main line goes knight e4, and white doesn't try to get back the pawn, at least not immediately. Castle, queen e2. The old main move which Kramnik tried to make work is the obvious knight c6, but this move proves to be inaccurate because white can easily develop an attack against the black king. You can easily imagine bishop d3, the knight can go maybe to g3, and then queen e4 with very dangerous threats. So in fact, black has to keep the knight for a while here, keeping as well the option to further be developed to d7 and f8 to try and defend some critical squares against or around the black king. So here Caruana played bishop e7, which is a move which has first been played by Georg Meyer, the German grandmaster. Georg and I used to work together at the start of the years 2010, and we took this system under examination. It's actually Georg who is responsible for, gets all the credit for the work we have done, because he was the main incentive, and he developed many ideas, and in the end he came to the conclusion that bishop e7 should be the most accurate, even though well, he's played other moves too here. Well, Aronian played rook a1 to d1 here, and it's actually an important question for white to try and determine which rook to put on d1. At first sight, when I said, well, white wants to attack on the king side, it seems much more logical to play rook a d1 and keep this rook here for possible action on the king side. But in fact, white, you know, his attack is never really going to be linked with anything with f4, or even the a file is not so crucial for the rook. So here some concrete moments are actually important here, and it appears that in my understanding of this variation, rook fd1 is more accurate. The point is that the same answer as against rook ad1, queen c7 here is pointless. There is rook ac1, and the queen feels very badly here on c7. In other words, after rook fd1, queen b6 has to be played. And I have had this position with black twice. First in a rapid game against Etienne Bacrot, when well, here he took on d4 with the rook, but after knight c6 everything is fine for black, who is actually able to try and force some exchanges quite early on. The main challenge is, of course, knight g3. The thing is, white would like to take on d4 only when he is able to switch immediately with the rook on the fourth rank towards the black king. Now rook takes d4 is definitely a threat, so he played rook d8 against Romain Edouard in a game in the Swiss League in 2014. White went knight h5, and here I didn't play the most accurate move. I should have developed the knight b8. Instead of this I played g6, and here my opponent also didn't react well. After knight f6, king g7, black is absolutely fine, and actually I even managed to get the upper hand later on. The game ended in a draw, but I was better. Well, unfortunately g6 is bad because of queen d2. This is a novelty which is actually very strong, not very difficult to spot, and even computers will come up with it if you leave them long enough. Well, here the main line is just g takes h5. There is nothing really better. Queen takes here, bishop f8, queen takes h5. Well, I've managed to find a way to survive with black being just worse, not completely lost. But basically, theoretically, this is not possible. So obviously here the critical moment when black has to find an improvement. I still think that rook fd1 is more accurate than rook ad1. Let's see what happened in the game. Queen c7. And that's actually important. The queen is doing better on c7 than on b6 or other squares, because it keeps an eye on e5. So if rook takes d4, knight c6 again. In this position, Aronian played a novelty. It had been played before, knight g3, in 2 games by Georg Meyer where he was black. One of them went rook d8, bishop d3, knight d7. You can see the knight ready to go to f8. Bishop b1, knight f8, knight h5, and here, well, black could play maybe developing moves like bishop d7, but Georg Meyer went for d3, and this is a typical move which should always be remembered for black players if they want to play this line. d3, trying to cut the coordination between the white forces in the sense of a white attack here. And that game Meyer played against Yotov in 2012. White took on d3, Meyer played bishop d7, and the position is absolutely fine for black. Aronian played bishop d3 immediately, and here knight d7 is a good move. Well, hitting e5 immediately. Rook c1, queen a5, and here Aronian played a very interesting move, sacrificing another pawn. it has to be said that if he plays knight to g3, normal idea, here there comes knight c5, bishop b1, and again this move d3, when black is perhaps even more than fine in this position. The computer says knight ed2 is good here. Well, it's true that white has a point, because now after knight c5, which is a playable move, knight b3 is coming, keeping the bishop on d3, takes on b3, pawn takes b3, rook d8, queen e4. Here black plays g6 and is okay actually. He's well, still a pawn up, although white can win it on d4 at some point certainly, but black will be able to develop maybe with bishop d7, bishop c6, and it's not so easy for white to find some attacking possibilities after queen f4. I'd say just bishop f8 and black should be fine. So well, Aronian played g4. That's very interesting. He just leaves e5 attacked. He goes all out for an attack. Knight takes, e5 takes, queen takes, and f4, that's his idea. Now after queen d5, which would seem quite logical because the queen remains centralized. This is always a good thing to do when you are under an attack. But still, well, rook c7 is possible still after bishop d8, rook back, queen d7. It appears that black is able to defend his position. So g5 should be played, and now it's indeed quite a mess. You don't really want to take on g5, it would open too many lines. But what to do? Well, bishop d7 seems normal, g takes f6, h6, and if you, well, you have to be careful. Now a bad trick is g6, running into rook c5. That would be pretty nasty, because taking here is impossible. Oops, not because of this, sorry, but knight f6, of course. My mouse reacted a bit too fast, so black has to play rook fc8. Queen g2, it looks quite dangerous. g6, takes, f5. It's impossible to take on f5, it would cost the queen after ef and knight f6 again. Well, so black has to try queen e5, and here, well, the computer is getting a bit crazy. It doesn't really know who is better here, so it's not a really good sign for black, I'd say. In any case, I wouldn't really like to defend the black's position in a game here. So I believe Caruana's move queen a5 is good. g5, and here he went queen d8, which is a move he could play also after queen d5. But actually g6 immediately is an interesting way to try and protect some things here. Well, black would like to play h5 basically. That would close lines. So g takes h6 seems to be normal, and then queen h7. And it's not that easy for white to attack, especially it's easy for black to play a few moves to improve his position. Bishop d7 for instance, then bishop c6, or even before bishop c6, you can imagine first rook c8. If you manage to exchange some pieces, then you'll be absolutely fine with black, even better than fine. So here black could actually hope to be better. Well, the move played in the game is not that bad, queen d8. It's just that it's a bit less natural maybe. Well, if gh, of course g6 again, queen g4, king h8, and here it should be okay for black, even though he has to be very careful. So Aronian played h4, going for an attack, keeping on the attack, of course. And the computer wants to play f5 at first, but I don't think it's really good here. You can take, and play knight g5. That's a pretty dangerous continuation. Queen e4 is coming. You don't want to take on g5, perhaps just because of fg. You know, opening the f file and other lines here, so that appears to be very, very dangerous. Caruana, on his guard, played bishop d7, gh, g6, h5. You know, all these moves by white, and of course by black too, they make sense. He didn't play h4 for nothing. He was going for h5 here. You don't want to take on h5, that would be too dangerous. So he plays king h8. Computer wants to take here, but I think Aronian was wise enough not to do that, even though computer's evaluation here is about level. I think black is actually happy that the F file has been opened for his rook. So by keeping tension here and playing a move like King H2, white, you know, prevents black from getting too many pieces active. Bishop C6. Well, the computer at first says Rook F2, and I've seen that move mentioned by some commentators, but Queen D5, I don't really see how white can do well here. Actually, Queen takes H5 is a threat. Well, at least with the Rook on F3, the Rook can also be brought to H3 to counter such ideas as Queen takes H5 later on. So Caruana played Bishop D6, and these two bishops actually are very dangerous. I mentioned them as a weapon for an endgame, but at the moment they are pretty dangerous, aiming at the white king. If white takes on D6, well, Queen takes D6 is probably the safest. If bishop takes F3, Queen E5 check, this is very tricky now. F6, Queen takes E6, not something you want to allow here, even though the computer claims that black is okay. Knight F7, look at this. Queen takes, and here you already have to play something like Queen F8. Again, the computer says it's okay, but to go for something like this in a game, you really need courage. So Queen takes D6 is safe, and actually it's objectively even better. Rook F2, G takes H5, and it's not even clear to whom the G file, the opening of the G file, is going to benefit more. Could be black actually. So Aronian plays on quite a clever way. Queen F2. He keeps on, you know, putting some practical questions to his opponent. Bishop C7, King H3, trying to unpin the F pawn or prevent a check. Queen E7, Knight G5, and here, all right, I decided to give Caruana's next move a question mark. Of course, this is it's very tough to criticize black's play, and I'm not actually criticizing Caruana, but objectively his move hands away or gives away the advantage. He could still have an advantage according to the computer thanks to GH, Rook G1, and just Rook AD8. This Rook was not active yet, and now it's coming into play, and it turns out that white doesn't have enough threats here, so black is actually better in this position. But I can actually understand that Caruana was a bit maybe suspicious about this continuation, you know, even something like Rook G3. You know, at first sight it looks very, very risky for black. So the move played is very natural, very human, but actually it allows Aronian to keep the balance. But things are so complicated that and Aronian was also in time trouble, so he actually, at first he played really well. Rook takes C6, he sensed that he had to eliminate this bishop. B takes C6, Knight takes F7, Rook takes, and Pawn takes G6. Well, it's not an easy decision to take. Well, perhaps here, again, I could have criticized the next move of Caruana, because actually his move leads to a draw. Whereas with Rook takes F4 here, he could have still played maybe for an advantage, even though after this smallest forced line, takes on F4, Queen takes D4, you have to play Queen E5. And now G5, oh sorry, G7 check, King G8, Bishop C4 check, King H7, Queen D3 check you have to take here, and white recovers the rook he has sacrificed. Black remains a pawns up, queens are on the board, but also opposite colored bishops. I think that, okay, of course black still has chances to try and hope to try and win this game, but in practice I think that white should be able to hold that. I've given an advantage for black at the end of this line, but I'm actually in practice not so sure that he would be able to win. Well, Rook F6 actually should have led to a draw. G7, King G8, if not for Aronian's blunder in this position. He was in time trouble. It's not easy, but actually the continuation he chose in the game quite clearly leads to a loss. So he might have seen it and just failed to find another resource here, but it was available, it was here. Queen h4 would have been really good here. And actually black can also lose that game. If he plays queen d6, for instance, a move which I have seen commented or recommended in some analysis somewhere, then queen g5 actually wins for white. Rook takes h6, king g2. And what are you gonna do against bishop c4? Well, actually it's even, yeah, it's actually lost here for black, as surprising as it may seem. Another queen move, queen e6 check, f5, queen d6, hoping that closing this diagonal would help to blockade with king h7 next move. But this loses as well. Queen g5, king h7, and king g4. And it's very difficult and perhaps even impossible for black to move. White has numerous threats, and he would actually win here. Bishop c4 again is actually very unpleasant. So black actually can force a draw in two ways. E takes f4 is the easy one when white has nothing better but to give perpetual check here with a bishop. And e4 is tricky, but white can also force a draw with h7. Well, tricky for white mostly because he has to find a few nice moves. Look at this, rook g8 here, not easy. Bishop c4 now, king g7 queen, g5 check. You cannot interpose the rook because of this pin here. Rook g6 impossible. You need to move the king to h7, the only move to prevent mate. Queen g8, king h6, queen g5, king h7, and moves will be repeated. A draw is actually the logical outcome from this. Queen h4 here. Instead of this, bishop c4 check loses immediately, king h7, and the point is, of course, e4 is gonna come and blockade this diagonal. Queen h4, e4. Well, the king is on h7, there is no pawn to h7 anymore, and rook takes h6 is looming. Well, here rook g3 was played, and he found bishop takes f4. That's the best move. g8 queen takes king h8, and now rook takes h6 will be devastating, and Aronian resigned after rook g7 and queen f8. I'd say that Caruana's opening choice was actually very clever. First of all, it was unexpected from Aronian. Aronian could not expect this from Caruana, and therefore it was clear that he would not be able to remember all his preparation, which he has certainly done at some point in his career, but remembering all details is by far not easy in these complicated lines. And as said, it's complicated. Black agrees to take some risks by giving his opponent an attack, but he also has some very nice strategic features in his position. Two bishops, solid center in general. So if white's attack doesn't succeed, then black will certainly be able to turn over the tables, and this is exactly what happened in this game. Thanks to this win, Caruana managed to take the lead in the candidates tournament at halfway. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like it and subscribe to my channel if this is the case.